And round about 1991, the IRA discovered that the person who was second in command of their internal security group was a British agent. Now, I say that, although it is actually contested, the IRA deny that this gentleman was an agent. It was around this time the gentleman retired from the IRA and went back to his building trade in West Belfast. And he and the IRA agreed to say that they would not say why it was he had ceased to be an IRA operative and why he had retired. And the reason why this was done is quite simply, it would have been devastating to the Republican movement for it to admit that it had been penetrated to that level. And of course, you see the problem, what a part of the problem is that during the period when this gentleman, whose code as an agent was steak knife, during the time he'd been an agent, the internal security unit had killed about 30 members of the IRA as suspected informers, which then raises a whole can of worms as to whether these persons who were killed as being informers were really informers or were they killed to cover up other informers. And then, of course, if these people, when they were killed, did steak knives handlers know what was going on? Did they actually authorize it? And even worse, did they select who it was that should be killed by the internal security unit? Now, this is, fairly grim from the point of view, of just ourselves looking at it, but even grimmer from the point of view of the Republican movement. Even worse, and I'm not sure if the IRA realized this in 1992, steak knife's boss was also a British agent. So, and they were not, we are told, we don't know the full story of that, these two were not necessarily the highest planted agents within the IRA, which leads a lot of people to speculate as to which other people might be agents and where they are, and what else is going to come out about this. Anyway, there was the Republican movement, as a result of discovering the extent to which they'd been penetrated and the security force pressure on them, could see in the changed atmosphere of 1992, and the changed atmosphere comes from the fall of communism. The existence of the Soviet bloc was a resource for the IRA. Maybe not a huge resource, but a resource nonetheless. They presented themselves as being socialist revolutionaries. But the collapse of socialism undermines that. And the success of democracy, again, undermines the whole raison d'etre of this terrorist organization and makes it look even more, out of place and more, lacking in any form of legitimacy. And so that reinforced the domestic pressure that there was coming from the nationalist community in Northern Ireland on Republicans to move. So those were the push factors. There were pull factors. After the hunger strikes, the Republican candidates had some electoral success, although that had been dissipated by the early 90s, partly because violence was still a millstone in electoral terms. But corollary, if violence was a millstone in electoral terms, giving up violence might open up electoral opportunities for them. And then there was the argument put forward at this time by one particular theoretician within the Republican movement, Danny Morrison, who in a famous article, not published until some time later, argued that in fact, if you look at unionism, it was violence from Republicans that actually united unionists. And if there was an absence of violence, then unionism would fragment. And indeed, Morrison's thesis proved to be correct, because that is what did happen after the ending of the IRA campaign. Divisions occurred within unionism. And then Republicans thought they could balance that by creating what they called a pan-nationalist front. And the pan-nationalist front, they thought, was to involve Republicans, moderate nationalists in the SDLP, the Irish government, Irish Americans with the influence that they could exert here on the US government. And the idea was that if we put together this pan-nationalist front, we could create a talks process where hopefully the unionists would walk out, and the nationalists then would be left confronting a British government to persuade it to make major changes in Northern Ireland. In other words, to do a super version of the Anglo-Irish Agreement, making a huge step towards their objective of a united Ireland. That's part of the thinking that, as I say, it was the pull factor that was behind that, and the interaction of the two. And in the interaction of the two, we see the reasons why Republicans started to move away from violence towards the political process in the early 1990s. But it took some time for them actually to get into politics. I often wondered at that time whether Jerry and Martin sort of drew a contrast between their experiences in the 1990s and their experience in the early 70s. I mentioned talks that took place between the British government and the IRA in 1972. Those talks took place after a few days into a rather shaky ceasefire that had been called without any indication as to whether the ceasefire was going to last for more than a few days. An IRA delegation was secretly flown to a location in London to meet the British Secretary of State. The delegation consisted of the leadership of the IRA, which at that time was essentially Dublin-based. But the Dublin-based leadership thought they should balance their leadership by bringing in a couple of key activists from Northern Ireland, and they happened to be Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. Indeed, Gerry was released from custody in order to be part of the delegation. So I often wondered, in the period between 1992 and 97, did Gerry reflect on the difference between 92 and 97? Because, not 92, 94. 94 was the first ceasefire, but it wasn't until 3 years later that they actually got into talks. And during those 3 years, they had to negotiate various conditions that were being laid down by both the British and Irish government as to what they should do. The situation in the 1990s is that the government's engagement with paramilitaries was not unconditional as it had been in 72, but was now highly conditioned. And those conditions were ones really effectively compelling the paramilitary organization to make a very significant, indeed irrevocable commitment to the political process, rather than just try it for a while to see if it worked and then go back to violence elsewhere. As I say, the Republicans actually joined the talks in 1997, where already the talks were operating on the basis of sufficient consensus. And furthermore, there had been the enunciation at the beginning of that year of a set of principles drawn up by a committee headed by George Mitchell, former US Senator, setting out various principles. These were a rewrite of what had been agreed between the British and Irish governments in a declaration called the Downing Street Declaration, issued in December 1993, but it was a rewrite appropriate to the circumstances just there in 97, when the question of the decommissioning of paramilitary weapons was highly controversial, but also people were looking at the prospect of Republicans joining the talks, which they did in September of that year. And the Mitchell principles, two of them are actually hugely significant from the point of view of the political negotiation, because it bound all the parties to renounce for themselves and to oppose any effort by others to use force or threaten to use force to influence the course of the outcome of the all-party negotiations. And then to agree to abide by the terms of any agreement reached and to resort to democratic and exclusively peaceful means in trying to alter any aspect of that outcome. Now, at that stage in 1997, there had been an election in 96. The SDLP got more support than Sinn Féin, so the SDLP were the majority party within nationalism. Sinn Féin were a minority party within nationalists. So the Sinn Féin were joining a political process where they had no veto, and they had bound themselves through the Mitchell principles to accept the outcome of that process, and only to use normal democratic means of changing the outcome if they didn't like it.